It's time for Inside Silicon Valley, a look at issues affecting Silicon Valley. Now here's your host, Russell Hancock, President and CEO of Joint Venture Silicon Valley.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is Inside Silicon Valley. We're so glad that you've joined us. This is a program where we talk about Silicon Valley's issues, all of them. We talk about who we are as a community, who we're becoming, what our trends happen to be, what our challenges are, and how we might overcome them. All of that is always the subject matter for this program right here on 1590 KLIV. Today our subject is wireless communications. We want to be talking about the infrastructure that we have here in Silicon Valley, the explosion of devices that all of us are using, what that means for the infrastructure. And to talk about it, we wanted to bring in somebody who is a leader in the wireless technologies and in the industry. So our guest today is Mr. David Witkowski. He specializes in strategic planning, troubleshooting, organizational development. He's had a career spanning 30 years, starting out as an electronics technician in the U.S. Coast Guard, and he's since held positions of leadership and responsibility at companies ranging in size from Fortune 500 multinationals to small pre-funded startups. David Witkowski, great to have you in studio today.
Thank you. Good morning.
Thanks for joining us. I want to tell our listeners that currently you serve an important position. You're the president of the Wireless Communications Alliance. Right. You can learn more about that at wca.org, but it's a nonprofit. It provides education. It works on connectivity issues. It provides a sense of community to folks that are working in the wireless industry. So we are going to be talking about all of that today. Why don't we start by you telling us a little more about the organization, WCA, Wireless Communications Alliance, and its mission.
Sure, absolutely. So the WCA was founded in 1993. Actually, it was founded as a workshop in Joint Venture Silicon Valley.
Tell our listeners more about that.
Well, at the time, in the early 90s, there were a lot of people who were in the defense industry in Silicon Valley who were being displaced by the demilitarization that was going. The administration at the time was attempting to achieve a peace dividend. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of companies, the programs were being shut down, and the defense companies were finding that their workers were being displaced because they had been in secret projects. They couldn't really talk about what they had done in their careers, and so they didn't really have very good networks. So what it was believed was that if they could find a way to network in the commercial industry, that we could take that talent and move it out into the commercial sector. And so the WCA started as a workshop in Joint Venture Silicon Valley and eventually became a nonprofit in its own right. For the past 18 years, we've been focused on providing that community for people in the wireless industry.
Very good. What are your priorities in terms of Silicon Valley's own connectivity issues?
Well, we serve as a hub to provide education for people who want to know more about what the Silicon Valley's wireless industry can do. We serve as a connection for people that are looking for either to hire or people who are looking for work. So it's somewhat interesting that during the downturn, the WCA actually gets more popular.
Yes.
Because people are saying, hey, I'm looking for work, or during the times when there's a boom going on, you get a lot of companies coming in and saying, we really want to network with your members to find people to come and fill these positions that we're having a hard time finding people to apply for. And then we serve as a community as well, just simply to give people a sense of the Silicon Valley in the work that they do in the industry and how they can network with other people. So we've had companies that have formed because of connections that have been made at the WCA. We've also had companies that have been acquired by major corporations that have done so because they were on stage at an event where a major corporation was also on stage, and the company eventually was acquired by the corporation. So we try to bridge the gap between major corporations, large multinationals, and the small startups, even pre-funded startups that of course, the Silicon Valley is so famous for.
Right. Okay, very good. That's helpful to our listeners. And more is at wca.org. It's your organization's website. How about if we start at the beginning, give our listeners a primer on wireless communications technologies and the infrastructure that is required.
Okay.
And where we're ultimately going here is we want to understand where Silicon Valley stands and what our problems and challenges are.
Sure. So in the Silicon Valley, I mean, certainly wireless is it's a very broad term. I mean, it can encompass everything from RFID sensors all the way up to cellular, even the radio that we're broadcasting on right now. Certainly there's, when you talk about wireless, you have to sort of define what it is that we're speaking of. And so I think that in the context of your question, the answer is that in the mobility industry, or the Web 3.0 as it's sometimes termed, we have this explosion of smartphones that's going on right now. You know, you have your iPhone, I have my Droid, we all have our smartphones now, and these are amazing devices.
It is an explosion too.
It is an absolute explosion. I heard the other day that Google reported at Mobile World Congress in Barcelona that they are activating 850,000 Android devices per day around the world. It's insane. I mean, we're moving from, you know, we moved into the internet economy, and then now we're moving into the mobile economy. And you know, how does that affect our networks is really the question. We all want that rich multimedia experience that comes from having a phone that's capable of delivering data rates that are faster than your DSL modem at home. And yet, the network itself, I mean, that's a blessing and a curse for the carriers, because on one hand, this is a huge value proposition that they can make to their customers. On the other hand, they have to get the data across the network to you. And I think that's where the key challenge lies, is that as we expect more and more data, as we expect our mobile devices to do more and more, we need that network to be very responsive.
Exactly.
And how many times have you gotten frustrated because you know you couldn't get access to something? Or
it happens to all of us. Every day.
It happens,
and it is frustrating.
And it also happens in that cases where, say, for example, you have a high concentration of mobile users. So if you say, for example, something happens and a lot of people are trying to take video and upload it to YouTube because they're reporting on something, there's this notion of sort of you are the reporter, you're the person on the scene. And how many times have we had videos that are taken by just average citizens?
That's right.
Well, everyone's doing that. So that's a huge amount of data that has to flow, and it's concentrated into one or two cell sites at the time that it's occurring. So the network has to be able to accommodate these high bandwidth requirements. And in most of the time, the bandwidth requirement might not be so high, but there are times when it is. There's going to be a lot of demand on the network, and we need to be able to have the network expand and breathe, if you will, to accommodate this use.
So there's at least two things going on here. One is that the devices themselves are more powerful, need all kinds of bandwidth. The other thing is that there's just more people using more devices. In fact, that's been an explosion. Did I hear correctly? There's more phones than people.
At this point, I believe they've said that we've reached the point where there are more phones in the world than people. That's correct.
Unbelievable.
It is. It's fantastic. And
so you need infrastructure to support all of that. And average folks out there, like me, just expect that the infrastructure will be there and that somebody's taking care of it. But we know it's not that simple.
That's correct.
So tell us how we're doing in Silicon Valley and compare us to other regions.
Well, recently there's been a trend in the cellular industry away from well, let me back up a little bit. In the cellular industry, the cell sites that we're typically used to thinking about are referred to as macro cells. These are higher level cells. You see them on towers around town, and they cover a wide area. And the challenge with that is that, one, there are often cases where those cells don't reach into, say, what's called an urban canyon. So you're in downtown San Francisco in the financial district, and you've got very high buildings, and so you really need a cell that covers only a street or even a small segment of a street. So we're moving away from this, what's called a macro cell architecture, to what's called a small cell architecture. And small cells are either metro cells, which are intended to cover street level. We have pico cells, and then even what are called femto cells. And femto cells are cells that might even just cover, say, a store or one floor of a department store, or even one section of one floor of a department store. And so in order to cover the network and have that granularity, so that not everyone is loading onto one big macro cell, the carriers are moving to segment it and make those cells cover smaller areas, but have more of them. And in fact, it was reported in Barcelona this week that the number of small cells by the end of this year will be higher than the number of macro cells that we've had to date. So it's about, by the end of the year, they estimate 3.2 million small cells. That number is expected to grow to 59 million worldwide within 4 years. So it's a 20x increase in the number of cell sites that are going to be available to users. That's fantastic, because you're going to not be competing with other users for these macro cells and the capabilities that are in the cell, but you have a challenge. You have to get data in and out of a lot of data in and out of a lot of smaller cells. And what the problem is that there's a challenge called backhaul. And well, backhaul really means it's the connectivity, if you will. If you think about a small cell as being like a Wi-Fi access point in your home, the backhaul would be analogous to your DSL. And it means that every small cell that we deploy in the network has to have a high bandwidth data connection going to it. Now, that's a huge challenge, because you're talking about a lot of places where somebody has to climb a pole and attach, say, fiber optics to it. The economics of the situation are that it's probably not going to work that way. I don't believe, personally, and I don't think that the industry really believes, that you're going to run fiber to every small cell that gets deployed, 59 million small cells in the next 4 years. You have to have a wireless backhaul architecture that gets that data in and out of those sites. And that's currently something that we don't really have. I think that's the big challenge that's facing the industry over the next few years, is how do you do wireless backhaul to 59 million small cells that are going to be deployed?
So, in your view, how is that going to play out?
Well, I think that what needs to happen is the industry has to move towards what's called a millimeter wave architecture. And that millimeter wave architecture is going to operate, somewhere in the 100 gigahertz range, which is way above the frequencies that we're used to dealing with today. So there are engineering challenges that have to be addressed in order to get us there. There are spectrum challenges, meaning that the frequencies that those systems are going to work at have to be allocated by the FCC. There are standardization challenges that need to occur so that a small cell backhaul radio from, say, Ericsson can talk to another one from Alcatel-Lucent. You don't want to have a situation where you can only have one vendor having backhaul radios within a network. So you want to have some sort of standards that's going to allow people to take equipment from one vendor and interface it with another vendor. And those are things that today we don't have. So if predictions are correct, we've got 4 years to solve this problem. But unfortunately, today is sort of when we need all that in place. And so there's this huge urgency coming out of Barcelona this week at the Mobile World Congress. Just the amount of information that we're getting out of Barcelona about discussions and meetings that are being held about small cell is huge. It's the big topic this year. And I think that the industry is beginning to wake up and say that this is a challenge that we need to start solving today.
You're listening to David Witkowski. He's our guest on Inside Silicon Valley right here on 1590 KLIV. I'm your host, Russell Hancock. So David Witkowski, it seems to guys like me that we're always going to be having new technologies come along, new capabilities, which make the old infrastructure obsolete, and so we have to quickly build a new infrastructure. Is that far off the mark?
No, certainly the consumer demand drives that evolution of technology, and also the desire for, say, providers to differentiate. Carriers are competing with each other, AT&T, Verizon, trying to say that they've got the fastest network, the most reliable network, the best network, the most coverage. And the consumers are saying, hey, I want my 4G smartphone to work everywhere. Now, your 4G smartphone works fine in downtown San Jose, and you've got good connectivity there. You go over to Santa Cruz, well, it's not so good. You go anywhere outside of the core Bay Area, and you're going to have challenges.
Do us a favor. Do me a favor.
Sure.
I don't even know what 4G means.
I'm not sure that the industry knows what 4G means. So there's an organization called the ITU, which is an international standards organization that sets the definition for such terms as 3G and 4G and even beyond that.
Right.
4G was originally intended to be a standard that had a certain data rate and certain performance metrics that I won't go into because they're horribly technical and boring. But the bottom line was that when the carriers started rolling out what they were calling 4G, it didn't actually meet the 4G standard. So it was a marketing term as opposed to an actual compliance with the technical standard. And what happened was that they went to the ITU and they said, hey, we're not going to meet 4G. Can you please relax your definition a little bit so that we can truly say that we're 4G? And the ITU agreed to do that. So what we have today is what we call 4G. It's a marketing 4G, if you will. It's not truly 4G per the original definition.
Okay.
And at each level, when we talk about, so 1G was the original analog cellular, and there were two systems. There was the AT&T and the GTE system, and then they moved towards 2G, which had some digital capabilities on it. And then there was this funny melange of acronyms that came about. It was 2.5G, they even had weird terms like 2.75G, and then they went to 3G. And each one of these, G stands for generation, and it's an evolution of the standard as you go up into higher levels of capability.
Okay.
And so, of course, now we're in 4G, or what they've agreed to call 4G, and the next step will be 5G, and that means even greater data rates, even greater capabilities.
So again, for a dummy like me, 4G means we're using fourth generation technology on the network that is out there.
Right.
This network of towers and equipment.
Right, exactly.
Does that mean that we've now torn down all the 3G?
A lot of it is add-on, but there has been some, what's called a forklift upgrade, where they've gone in and simply replaced the equipment with the 3G equipment with 4G. But a lot of it is, the carriers know that they're going to have to spend money to do these upgrades. And so when they're thinking about deploying their 4G, they've also got an eye on what they're going to be doing for the next generation. And thinking about, okay, I'm going to have to do 5G in, say, 5 years. I need to be able to upgrade this equipment. So they kind of architect the network or architect the equipment setup in such a way that they can go in and start layering 5G on top of 4G.
Last question before we go to break.
Sure, absolutely.
Carriers are out there building this infrastructure, but there's multiple carriers.
That's true.
So do we have redundant infrastructure?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And is that the best outcome?
Well, in terms of competitiveness and it's a consumer's paradise to have multiple carriers, then when the AT&T was talking about merging with T-Mobile, there was a huge concern at the regulatory level that you were really going to get to a point where you had two carriers, AT&T and Verizon, and then certainly there's Sprint and Metro PCS and some of these other derivative carriers, and a lot of those, like for example, Metro PCS leases capacity from Sprint. So there are really the people that own the equipment is smaller than the number of carriers that are available to you when you go into a store to buy something. But they were very concerned that T-Mobile, that the absorption of T-Mobile into AT&T was going to create a situation in which the consumers would have less choice. And so not wanting to create a monopoly has been a concern for the government. And I think that consumers benefit from having choices. It certainly keeps the costs down. It gives us an option that if we don't like Verizon, we can go to AT&T. If we don't like AT&T, we can go to Verizon. But having a unified system, say like they have in Europe, with their GSM system, and then over the years it's evolved into they have a standard, and everyone in Europe uses the same standard. There is no AT&T Verizon competition there, but their costs are higher, and so the network is. I mean, you can buy a phone in Europe that works on any network anywhere you go in Europe, but they pay a lot more for what they have. So I think for us, if we're willing to pay more, it would be good to have a unified system, because we would have those standards across the network, but it would also mean more money out of our pockets.
Let's break on that note. We're gonna listen to a few messages, and then when we return, we're going to continue this conversation with David Witkowski of the Wireless Communications Alliance. Stay right where you are.
KLIV News Time is now 12:29. Time now to take a look at our Silicon Valley roadways. In the Palo Alto area, northbound 101 just north of University Avenue, we have a report of a vehicle blocking a slow lane. Tow truck on the scene there. That was last updated as of 12:24. And northbound 101 just south of Willow Road, a report of 3 vehicles involved in a traffic collision. They are currently blocking the slow lane. That was last updated as of 12:28 with the CHP on its way to the scene. In the Hollister-Gilroy area, Highway 152 mile marker 33, that was a report of a traffic collision. 2 vehicles involved in that incident blocking the number 2 lane. As of 12:16, the vehicles are now on the right shoulder of the roadway. CHP is on the scene. No further details on that incident. Currently, we have no other incidents to tell you about on any other Silicon Valley roadway at this time. And right now, we have no major slowdowns to report. Minor slowdown on Highway 17 southbound from Lark Avenue to Highway 9, where traffic is moving anywhere from 25 to 37 miles per hour in that area. Northbound 17, meanwhile, is moving at the limit at this time. Let's now return to our program Inside Silicon Valley with your host, Russell Hancock.
Welcome back. Russell Hancock here, your host. This is Inside Silicon Valley, and you're listening to 1590 KLIV. Our guest today is David Witkowski, and he is the president of the Wireless Communications Alliance. And we spent the first segment of our program talking about the infrastructure, the technology, and we were talking about it in general ways. I want to pose a question now, which is, you talked about how important it was to solve the backhaul problem. You see that as a major issue in deploying the next generation of infrastructure here in our region. So where are we with that? Do you see Silicon Valley in a leadership position?
Okay. I believe that there are many companies in the Silicon Valley that are looking to address this. So I know of some startups that have, for example, in the what's called smart antenna space. So one of the challenges that you have with these 100 gigahertz networks is going to be that you don't want to spew 100 gigahertz of radio energy in all directions. You really want to focus it. So some companies have started where they're developing smart technology that the cell site essentially electrically steers its antenna to point in the proper direction so that it can reach the next node in the network and ultimately get back to wire or fiber at a core, what they call a core site. And then there are also some companies that are doing work in the standards that are going to be necessary for this, the algorithms that are necessary to steer these smart antennas, certainly the radios themselves, radios that are capable of transmitting and receiving at 100 gigahertz. That's a somewhat of a stretch for the current technology that's on the market today. And then, of course, test and measurement. How do you deploy a network like this? And when you deploy it, you confirm that the network is working. My day job is not the WCA. My day job is I work at Anritsu down in Morgan Hill, which is a test and measurement house. And we make equipment that tests the cellular network. So we know that as the carriers are looking at these higher frequency systems and these higher frequency backhaul systems, that there's a test and measurement challenge. So there's a lot of activity going on right now, both here in the Valley and also in other parts of the country and even around the world. Certainly San Diego is a center of wireless. And
is it?
Oh, very much so. San Diego has been a center of hardware for many years. Qualcomm, of course, being a major driver for that.
Sure.
And they're funding a lot of research and development at UC San Diego to support the development of hardware that has ultimately gone into the phones that we use today for our 3G and 4G networks. The Silicon Valley has been dominant in developing apps, and we've certainly taken the lead in that. And other regions can't even come close to competing with what we've done here.
You're talking about the software that...
Yeah, the software that runs on the phone.
Right.
And certainly as we move into a social networking paradigm where Facebook and Google and Foursquare and all these apps that people love to use, that's all been done here in the Valley. So we have currently a very strong leadership position in the software.
Yes.
But as we move into this next generation of hardware, I think we need to have a bit more of a regional strategy to retain our leadership in that area. And that's a key challenge that I think the WCA has been looking at for the past couple of years. Certainly something that's on my mind pretty much all the time, is how do we retain that leadership? Because when the pendulum swings from software to hardware, I don't want to see it leave. I don't want to see it go down to San Diego, Austin, or for that matter, to go to Shanghai. I don't want it to leave the country. I want it to stay here in the Valley.
I want to explore more along these lines. First of all, you say the pendulum is going to shift from software to hardware. Will you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. There tends to be in the technology industry a pendulum, if you will, that swings between, say we develop faster computers and we get multi-core processors and we get faster integrated circuits, and so the computers become faster, and then people develop apps to leverage that new hardware. And then when the apps start to overload the hardware, then the pressure goes back into the hardware manufacturers to say, hey, can you make this faster? And you would think that they would rise sort of at the same rate, but what happens is that there tends to be this alternation. So phones get a lot of power. We've gone to multi-core, multi-processor cell phones now, and just a few years ago, there weren't even multi-core desktop PCs, and now we're in multi-core handhelds.
It's amazing.
It is amazing, and so now the software is beginning to take advantage of that. But then when you write a lot of software to take advantage of those multi-cores, you're going to reach a point where the phone's going to start to slow down because the app has been written to take advantage of increasingly more powerful. So we've all had this experience of you have the first generation Motorola Droid or the first generation iPhone, and you start to notice that, wow, this thing is really getting slow. And it's not just because
I had that experience.
It's not just because it's getting old and dusty. It's because people keep writing more and more advanced software that begins to outstrip the capability of that phone. So then Apple releases the iPhone 3, the iPhone 3S, the iPhone 4.
Yes.
And then we move on to these higher levels of technological capability, which enables the app developers to write better software. So we have been dominant. The Silicon Valley has been dominant in apps. And I've gone to other regions of the country and gone to meet with my peers at nonprofits in San Diego and Austin and places around the world where they can only dream of having the kind of app-based economy that we have here in the Silicon Valley. And they lament the fact that they can't get any traction in this. But 5 years from now, we could be sitting there saying, wow, I really wish we could do more in terms of hardware, but it's all gone to wherever. It's gone to San Diego, or it's gone to Austin, Texas, or it's gone to Mumbai or Shanghai.
Interesting.
So I think we need a regional strategy to take what we've done to date, the leadership that we have, and continue to move it forward. And I think we have the raw materials to make that happen.
Say more about that.
Well, the Silicon Valley, of course, benefits from access to world-class universities, multiple world-class universities that are within driving distance. We get the research that comes out of that. We have the graduates that come out of that. We have the connections into academia that we could leverage for academia, corporate partnerships. Some of the schools around the Bay Area are doing amazing things. Berkeley Wireless Research Center. Stanford has Tom Lee, who's a force of nature in RF and wireless. UC Davis, which was a school that I attended, has now Linda Katehi as the chancellor. Linda Katehi is one of the most prolific publishers of academic research in the microwave industry. She's published hundreds and hundreds of papers and journals, and she's an amazing technologist, and she has taken UC Davis from a school that was doing fairly well in wireless at the time that I was there, and really turned it into probably the number one school in the world that's doing RF and wireless research. And the amount of energy that they've applied towards making UC Davis a center, and it even outstrips what the traditional leaders in that field, Georgia Tech and such, used to be the area that you'd call the academic wireless or academic microwave research areas. So we have UC Davis right here. We have all these schools that are doing great work in technology. So how do we apply a strategy to bring that into implementation and have the Silicon Valley become a center of RF hardware, microwave hardware development that can apply itself to this backhaul challenge, and 10 years from now we'll still be in a leadership position? But I think that question still needs to be addressed.
I think I hear you saying you need something more than companies that are clustering and doing this kind of R&D. You also need some public-private structure.
I believe
in
so.
Place.
Yes, I do, and I also believe that we need to reach out to the federal level to help enable what we're doing here in the Valley to move forward.
So let's shift gears and talk for a minute about Silicon Valley and the Washington, D.C. connection. Sure. Because that's never been particularly smooth.
Yeah, I don't know that it has. I think that, in a lot of ways, and I've been in the pre-funded startup world, and I kind of know how that mindset goes. You start a company and you kind of hope that the government leaves you alone. Yes. You don't reach out to Washington, D.C. and say, hey, I'm starting a company.
Of course not.
Can you help me?
Of course not.
But of course, when you're going to do apps and such for phones, you don't need the government to help you. So when you're going to do hardware, microwave hardware, that requires you to have spectrum for that hardware to work on, then you definitely need to be working with the government. Because the FCC is going to say, well, we're going to grant you a license, even if it's a temporary license, to do some experiments in this particular frequency band. So I think one of the reasons that the Silicon Valley does not do as much with microwave hardware is because we don't have that ready access to the FCC. And so we have to send people back to Washington, or we have to hire law firms, Beltway law firms, that have former FCC commissioners working on there as partners, and they walk into their FCC and go to lunch with their friend and say, hey, my client needs blah. Right. And we have an FCC field office in San Francisco, but I've never quite understood why it's in San Francisco, because
curious.
That's not where the work is being done. It's being done down here. Yes. So I've often said that I think the FCC needs to move its field office here to San Jose, because it'll be, frankly, I mean, from a parking perspective, getting into and out of the city, it's a nightmare.
Yes.
But having it local would, I think, show the local hardware companies that the FCC is interested in supporting economic development in that space, and that we would then be able to go in and meet with FCC representatives and not have to hire. Most startups don't have the money to hire Beltway law firms to go in and advocate for special licensing. So we need that. We need that outreach, if you will. We need Washington, D.C. to say, what can we do to enable you to be successful here in the Silicon Valley?
So there's another thing for our checklist. Our guest is David Witkowski. You're listening to 1590 KLIV. The program is Inside Silicon Valley, and I'm your host, Russell Hancock. I'm the president of Joint Venture Silicon Valley. You can learn more about us at jointventure.org. We team up with KLIV to bring you this program on a weekly basis. So, David, let's talk more about the infrastructure and its shortcomings and how we address those. There's inefficiencies here. There's also a frustration on the part of folks that live here that we have these world-class devices and they're invented here, but we don't have a world-class infrastructure in place to support them.
Yeah, that's true.
How do we get at that problem?
Yeah, well, that's really true. I've often said that Silicon Valley tends to outsource all of its good stuff, or not outsource, but sell it elsewhere.
Right.
So we. If you go to small towns in the Midwest, they have these amazing traffic systems where the lights know that you're coming and they turn green.
Right.
Meanwhile, we sit at the stoplights in San Jose waiting for 2 minutes at an empty intersection. I don't know why we do this, but
this is really frustrating.
It is really frustrating.
I mean, am I wrong? Folks think that there's better infrastructure in Asia, in China, in Korea, in Mongolia. They say you can be on the top of a tall peak and use your cell phone, no problem.
That's really true. I think that it's. It's frustrating for me, if I go over to Santa Cruz, for example, and I'm getting, I have a 3G phone, but I'm getting barely 2G rates over there. I think that for some reason, we tend to have a very sort of, it'll come at some point mentality about wireless here in the Valley. And you're right, if you travel internationally, you can get amazing data rates, connectivity, and you can be out on a bay in or you can be out on the Mediterranean on a boat.
Yes.
And be getting cell coverage.
Okay, so explain this. How do you account for the discrepancy? What are they doing that we're not?
Well, I think that one of the things that they have in those areas is certainly more of a central planning. The Silicon Valley has always been sort of a wild, wild west, if you will.
Yes.
We're very decentralized, and we have a lot of different groups that are doing different things, different companies that are doing different things, a lot of startups that are all trying to do, and it's actually horribly inefficient. And the end result is usually great.
Yeah.
Because what happens is that there's this technological Darwinism occurs, and the companies that are successful rise to the top and the others fall away. So we benefit from the fact that we've got venture capitalists that are willing to fund numerous companies. Say back in the days when we were doing Wi-Fi, there were dozens of companies that were trying to do Wi-Fi. Now, that boiled down to a small handful, less than 5 at some point, that technology just went, and eventually all those other companies fell away.
Right.
So, but the knowledge that we developed from all those different companies working simultaneously was huge, and that eventually rolled up into the technologies that we have today. In other parts of the world, in say Korea, they have the government says, we're going to have the best cellular network in Asia. We're going to have the best cellular network in the world. And they make an effort to say we're going to do that.
Right.
I talked earlier about, the fact that there are so many carriers being a consumer's paradise. That's true. It keeps the costs down. But it also prevents us from having that centralized strategy to move, say, the Silicon Valley forward. And so I think wanting to, retain that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yep.
The value of having a lot of parallel efforts is high, but maybe we need to figure out a way to aggregate that into a strategy as a region. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we face. How do we move that forward?
When it comes to infrastructure, this becomes a public good, and this is why we have public sector institutions which are charged with providing a public good. Roads and freeways, for example. We never said we're going to let lots of companies build lots of different roads and price them at different rates, and you can just choose your favorite road. We've never taken that approach, and yet we are taking that approach in terms of our wireless infrastructure.
You know, one thing that's happened in the past few years has been that Witkowski at the FCC, the FCC has been very big on this notion of LTE, long-term evolution broadband, being a potentially an economic recovery engine. And so they've applied LTE technology to problems, trying to roll out, for example, broadband to rural areas. For people that are they're on the other side of the digital divide. And we sit here and talk about complaining that our phone, my phone only does, it's 1 megabit. This is a first world problem, right? I can go to my father's house. He retired to a part of Tennessee where he doesn't even have cell coverage at all. He doesn't even. I have to drive into town to get a cell signal. Which is actually really nice when I go to visit him, because then no one can reach me. So that's really cool. But I think that the government has definitely said that we're going to make an effort to apply this LTE technology and try to enable that. Just this last week, the government approved the payroll tax bill. Part of that was to give some spectrum in the 700 megahertz band, what was called the D block, to public safety. And so there's now a spectrum that's been given to public safety for use in broadband. So there are cases where, say, after a disaster or during an emergency, where public safety needs to send files, or they want to take a picture and ship it back to the command center. So they want to send out a map and tell everyone, here's where the bad things are. You need to go in here and look for survivors or whatever. So we've never had that until last week. Now that the government has said that we're going to have the spectrum is going to be given to public safety. They've also applied $7 billion in funding to help deploy the network. There has to be a state local match to those funds of 20%. But that's a huge step forward. And so it does provide us with some spectrum. So this is an example, I think, of the FCC being proactive at the national level. Now, if the FCC wanted to showcase what the U.S. could do in cellular, it might be a good idea for them to look to the Valley to say, how can we create a world-class showcase broadband wireless system that we can then replicate around the country. And I don't think that there's that outreach today. So the strategy on broadband for the FCC has been national, but there hasn't been this sort of regional partnership. And I would certainly like to see that, because we could be the showcase for that. And I would think the world would look to that and say, hey, when I go to the Silicon Valley, they got a network that's better than Korea, and that's saying something. And if we could do that, I think it would be huge.
Our guest is David Witkowski, President of the Wireless Communications Alliance. We want you to stay right where you are, listen to these messages, and then when we return, we'll conclude this interesting conversation right here on 1590 KLIV.
KLIV News Time is now 12:51. Let's now take a look at our Silicon Valley roadways. Skyline Boulevard just north of Alpine Road. A report of a traffic collision that was last updated as of 12:46. In the Palo Alto area, northbound 101 just north of University Avenue, we have a report of a traffic hazard there. That was a report of a vehicle blocking the slow lane. Tow truck and CHP are now on the scene. That was last updated as of 12:35. In the Hollister-Gilroy area, Highway 152, mile marker 33, that was a report of a traffic collision there. That was a report of two vehicles blocking the number 2 lane. The vehicles are now on the right shoulder of the roadway as of 12:16, and as of 12:28, no further details on that incident. CHP is currently on the scene. No other incidents to tell you about on any other Silicon Valley roadway at this time, and currently we have no major slowdowns to report. Highway 17 is moving at the limit in both directions until you get close to Highway 1, where it starts to slow up at Pasatiempo Drive all the way to Highway 1. Must be the beautiful weather luring all the tourists over the hill. No other slowdowns to report, and no other incidents to mention. Right now, we have KLIV News Time, 12:52. Let's now return to our program Inside Silicon Valley with your host, Russell Hancock.
Welcome back. This is Inside Silicon Valley, and our guest today is David Witkowski from the Wireless Communications Alliance. David, we don't have much time left, but in our previous segments, you were talking about a vision of making Silicon Valley a showcase for wireless connectivity. What do you think would be our best strategy for moving that vision forward?
Well, I think that the strategy to move that forward involves 4 elements.
Okay.
The first is that we need to continue to build community. We have a lot of nonprofits in the Valley, the WCA being one of them, that address technology. I would like to see us come together at a regional level.
Yep.
We did that in 2009. We hosted a regional summit. All the nonprofits came together under one roof. Each produced a segment. It was very successful. We're very well received. We need to sort of start feeling that each other are competitors and start working together. So we need a regional approach towards aggregating those nonprofits into more of a unified group.
Okay.
I believe that Washington, D.C. needs to do whatever it can to promote R&D in the wireless sector here in the Valley, and to promote commercialization of technology. Making the R&D tax credit permanent would go a long way towards opening people's willingness to invest in technologies.
That's been a big Silicon Valley priority.
It has been, yes, and I agree with it completely.
Yep.
I also believe that Sarbanes-Oxley, although it was created for the right reasons, it had an unintended consequence of a suppressive effect on the IPO market. And frankly, it's at this point, it's a lot easier for a company to IPO overseas than it is to IPO here in the United States, and that's a problem.
It is.
We need to incentivize top talent to remain in the U.S. We have a lot of people coming from overseas going to these top universities that I've spoken about here in the Bay Area.
Yes.
And then they leave and they go home and they start companies overseas. So they're learning our ways. They're learning what we do here in the United States, and they're taking that back, and it's not benefiting the U.S. So I think that we need to figure out a way to incentivize graduates from these top universities to stay here in the U.S. The WCA has also been supporting over the past few years the Synopsys Science Fair. We provide a wireless prize every year. So if a student does a wireless project, we give them a financial award. I think that I would challenge the other organizations in the Valley, the other nonprofits, my cohorts, to do that. We need to really promote this notion of students getting involved in wireless, because 10 years from now, they're the ones who are going to be solving these big challenges that we're facing. And then finally, Washington, D.C. needs to focus on investment in Silicon Valley by providing services that will enable our companies to be successful. And, for example, we need a local U.S. patent office. We need a local NTIA office. And I don't understand why the FCC is in San Francisco. I really believe that the FCC should relocate to the federal building in downtown San Jose to give us that ready access that we need. So that when we have to address Washington, D.C. about spectrum challenges or regulatory challenges, that makes it a lot easier for us to get in and talk to these people, because that partnership is going to be key to moving this vision forward.
What is it about the federal government? Why do they do that?
Well, I'm not sure that San Francisco, I guess, was seen as the city, and San Jose was the sort of that other place. And I don't know.
Cheaper rent down here and everything.
You know?
I mean, it's
parking's better.
Sure.
You know, we can stop in and see you after we go to the FCC. Yeah,
of course.
So I don't understand why we do that.
It's a big agenda.
They have taller buildings than we do. I don't. Other than that.
Tell me this, David Witkowski. If you were to pick one wireless technology which is likely to be the next big thing a decade from now, what would it be and why?
Well, certainly I think that backhaul, microwave backhaul is going to be the key technology. That is the thing that's going to enable us to build these 5G networks, that's going to enable us to keep moving forward in creating these devices, this rich mobile experience that consumers have come to expect. And without a backhaul technology that's easy for the carriers to deploy, we're going to have a very hard time doing that. Okay. And I think that it's the Valley is in a position to do that. I mean, we call ourselves the Silicon Valley, but the reality is that long before semiconductors came here, this area, San Francisco Bay, was a center of wireless and microwave development.
Interesting.
Going way back into the days of Varian, and we could have just as easily been called the Wireless Valley than the Silicon Valley. And I think that we have that history, we have the talent, we have the schools, we've got the capability to do it. We just need to execute.
He is David Witkowski, President of the Wireless Communications Alliance. He's been our guest today on Inside Silicon Valley. David, thank you so much.
Thank you, Russ.
A very enlightening conversation.